Hey guys, tonight we're stepping straight into the shadows of Greek mythology, and I need you to brace yourself because this isn't a gentle bedtime tale about heroes in shining armor. This is a bedtime story about the things that terrified even the gods, the monsters that made Olympus tremble, and the nightmares that slipped out of myth and into the hearts of ordinary people. Imagine lying under the stars in ancient Greece, hearing the ground rumble beneath you, and not knowing if it's just an earthquake, or something alive, rolling in the dark. That's the kind of fear we're diving into tonight. What makes this story different is that it's not just about gore or spectacle. It's about what those monsters meant to the storms that could swallow cities, the labyrinths built from guilt, the voices that punish truth-tellers. The ancients didn't just create monsters to scare their children. They created them to explain why the world felt so fragile, and why survival always came at a cost. And that's where you and I come in, because even though thousands of years have passed, those fears, the endless battles, the unfair punishments, the sense that chaos could erupt at any moment still feel eerily familiar in our modern lives. So, as you settle in, think of this as more than just a retelling. It's a walk through the dark with a quiet voice beside you, connecting you to every soul that ever sat by a fire and whispered, "What if the monster is real?" So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I love seeing how far this sleepy little time machine reaches. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The ground shakes. The air itself feels heavy, charged like the moments before a thunderstorm. In the world of ancient Greece, this wasn't just weather, it was a warning. The people who built marble temples and sang praises to Zeus also believed that, at any second, the earth could split open and unleash something far older, far more dangerous than the gods themselves. They called it Typhon. Not a god, not a man, but a storm wrapped in flesh, a monster so vast it made Olympus tremble. Picture this: a feast on Olympus, golden cups raised, laughter echoing against the clouds. Then the sky darkens, not dusk, not a passing storm, but a shape blotting out the stars. The gods, proud and eternal, scatter in terror. One legend says they fled across the sea, disguising themselves as animals in Egypt just to hide from what was coming. Imagine being mortal in that moment if even your gods were running. What chance did you have? Typhon wasn't the kind of monster you stabbed with a sword or tricked with a riddle. He was the sound of a volcano roaring to life, the crack of mountains splitting apart, the howling wind that could rip a roof from your home. He was the reason the ancients looked at the world around them: storms, earthquakes, fire, and felt small. And in that smallness came the question who really held the power, the gods on their thrones or the chaos rumbling beneath their feet. That's where we begin tonight, with a monster so terrifying that even Zeus, king of the gods, almost lost everything. If you've ever wondered how close the world came to falling apart, or what it feels like when the sky itself turns against you, stay with me, because Typhon isn't just a myth. He's a reminder that fear, when it grows too big, can swallow even the strongest. And here's where the night tightens its grip, because Typhon wasn't just another monster wandering through the Greek imagination. He was the apocalypse, wrapped in scales, crowned with fire, and carried on the backs of storms. The poets described him as so tall his head grazed the stars, his eyes burning like molten iron, his arms stretching from one edge of the horizon to the other. From the waist down, the nightmare only deepened, hundreds of venomous serpents twisting, hissing, snapping, each head moving with its own furious will. His voice wasn't a single sound, but a chorus of chaos, sometimes human, sometimes bestial, sometimes the shriek of a hurricane. Imagine every storm you've ever heard, every explosion you've ever feared, every howl of the wind that rattled your window at 3 a.m. All of it, roaring from one throat. The first clash between Zeus and Typhon wasn't the glorious triumph sung by bards. It was humiliation. Zeus, with all his lightning and all his pride, was struck down. His tendons, his very ability to move, were ripped from his body and hidden away. The king of the gods lay broken, stuffed in a cave like a trophy. For a time, the throne of Olympus sat empty, and the other gods scattered, disguising themselves as animals in far-off Egypt. Some became cats, some crocodiles, some birds. It's no coincidence that Egyptian temples are filled with animal-headed gods. For the Greeks, those were the shadows of their own immortals in hiding. Think about that, the mighty Zeus reduced to helplessness, Olympus abandoned, and the world trembling under the rule of a storm made flesh. But even chaos doesn't hold forever. Hermes, sly as ever, and Pan, half goat and all mischiefs, slipped into that cave. With tricks and songs, they freed Zeus, returned his stolen strength, and set the stage for round 2. This time the battlefield was Mount Etna, in Sicily. The sky cracked open as thunderbolts poured down like molten rain. Typhon fought back with hurricanes, sheets of flame, and the grinding roar of mountains splitting apart. The earth itself seemed ready to shatter. But Zeus, fueled by fury and the desperate knowledge that everything hung in the balance, unleashed power like never before. The mountain swallowed Typhon whole, pinning him beneath its weight, and there he lies, or so the Greeks believed, thrashing in his sleep, coughing out fire that bursts through the earth as lava. Every time Sicily shakes, every time Etna erupts, it's Typhon rolling over in his tomb. To the ancients, earthquakes weren't geology. They were a reminder that the monster was still there, biding his time. But here's the truth hidden in the myth. Typhon was never just a creature. He was a name for terror itself, for the helplessness of watching your home collapse under an earthquake, for the dread of seeing the horizon blaze with fire, for the sickening knowledge that the world doesn't answer to human plans. The Greeks had no tectonic plates, no science to explain volcanoes or hurricanes. Instead, they told each other. That's Typhon, because sometimes it's easier to face fear if you can give it a face. And maybe that's why Typhon still feels alive to us. We know he isn't under a mountain. We know eruptions come from pressure and fault lines. But when the ground shifts, when the storm howls so hard it rattles your bones, there's still that old whisper, what if the monster is real? So breathe with me now. The storm has passed. The mountain is still. The fire fades to embers. Typhon sleeps. And for tonight, so can you. But where there is a father of storms, there must also be a mother quiet, relentless, and far more unsettling. Her name was Echidna. The Greeks didn't give her a palace or a grand battle. No statues carved in her likeness. No hymns sung in her honor. She didn't need them. She was older than monuments, older than memory, and she lived not on Olympus but in the shadows of the earth. Imagine a cavern so deep the sun never touched it, the air thick with damp and silence. That's where they said she waited, half woman, half serpent, patient as the soil itself. She was beautiful in a way that frightened more than it invited. From the waist up, a woman with gleaming skin and eyes that seemed to see too much. From the waist down, a snake's coils, glossy and endless, winding into the dark. Her very shape was a paradox, the lure of attraction fused with the inevitability of being devoured. That contradiction made her more terrifying than any brute force. You didn't stumble into Echidna's presence like you might with a lion or a bandit. You were drawn, and once drawn, you never left. The ancients believed she gave birth to nearly every monster that haunted their world. Cerberus, the three-headed hound, the Hydra, with its endless heads, the Chimera, breathing fire, the Sphinx, whispering riddles that killed, even the eagle that feasted eternally on Prometheus's liver. One womb, an entire gallery of nightmares. And in that, there's something eerily human, because every fear we have, disease, betrayal, violence, has a birthplace. Echidna was that birthplace. She was less a character and more a force, the raw fertility of chaos, the womb that never asked permission. Think about it. Ancient Greek women were often invisible in public life, locked to the domestic sphere, their names lost even when their blood carried dynasties forward. Echidna mirrored that role. She stayed hidden, but her offspring defined the legends. Every heroic tale, every monster slain, every act of supposed glory was really just an echo of her shadow. Heroes weren't fighting random beasts, they were grappling with her legacy, again and again, as if the earth itself kept birthing new challenges just to remind mortals of their limits. Some later storytellers whispered that Echidna was immortal, ageless, that she never died and never aged, which makes sense. Fear itself doesn't vanish. It only takes new forms. The Greeks imagined she lived near Arima, a vague place no one could point to on a map. Some said Anatolia, some said beneath the earth, some avoided the question altogether. Where exactly doesn't matter. What mattered was that she was always there, just beyond reach, waiting to coil around the next story. If Typhon was fire and thunder, Echidna was silence and persistence. No dramatic roar, no lightning bolts, just the certainty that monsters keep coming, generation after generation. And isn't that familiar in our own world? The dangers we fear most rarely arrive as one giant storm. They creep in slowly, disguised as something ordinary stress that grows into collapse, habits that curdle into addictions, quiet injustices that multiply until they define entire lives. Echidna isn't gone. She's in the background of every hydra we fight, every maze we wander, every unfair battle we inherit. Art rarely painted her. Pottery showed her children. Flashy and violent, easier to decorate a vase with. But when she did appear, she was unmistakable calm, unapologetic, monstrous without shame. There's power in that. She didn't beg to be understood. She didn't roar for attention. She simply existed, and in that existence she terrified. And maybe that's the scariest truth of all. Monsters don't always need to rage. Sometimes they just need to keep breathing, quietly, endlessly, until you realize they've been shaping your story from the very start. Tonight. Echidna coils deeper into the dark, her brood scattered across myth, her presence hidden but never absent. She doesn't need to chase you. She only needs to wait. So close your eyes. The cave is sealed. The air is still. The serpent sleeps. Her monsters are already loose in the world, but here, for now, you are safe. But not every monster wore the crown of fame. Some lingered at the edges of memory, half remembered in fragments of poetry or scratched into the side of broken pottery. These were the creatures that didn't always headline heroic epics, but they were no less terrifying to the people who believed in them. And in their shadows, you can feel the raw pulse of fear, personal, immediate, and strangely familiar. Take Geryon, for instance. He wasn't just one man, not exactly. He was three bodies joined together, a fusion of limbs and faces that blurred the line between human and grotesque. Some said he had 3 heads on one torso. Others imagined 3 torsos with 6 arms, all pointing weapons at once. Either way, he was excess made flesh, an overwhelming reminder that sometimes strength is simply too much to face head-on. Heracles killed him, of course, because that's what heroes do, but imagine stumbling across him on some distant island, his herds of red cattle grazing while 3 sets of eyes all turn toward you at once. There's something deeply unsettling about the idea of one person multiplied, like a glitch in reality, and maybe that's the point. Geryon embodied the fear of duplication, of power splitting and multiplying until it swallowed individuality whole. Then there were the Stymphalian birds, not grand like Typhon, not cunning like the Sphinx, but swarms of metallic wings and sharpened beaks that tore at flesh like living weapons. Imagine the sky itself darkening as thousands of them took flight, the metallic clatter echoing like an army of knives. Heracles was sent to drive them off too, but it wasn't brute force that worked. He had to use a rattle, a noisemaker given to him by Athena, to frighten them into the air before striking. Think about that. A man who strangled lions and held the sky on his shoulders was undone until he found a trick, a sound to break their formation. To the Greeks, that mattered. It wasn't just about slaying beasts. It was about learning that even the strongest need cleverness, that chaos sometimes scatters when you find the right frequency. These aren't household names like Medusa or Cerberus. They don't get the glossy retellings in Hollywood movies, but maybe that's what makes them worth remembering. The forgotten monsters reflect quieter fears, the ones that still creep into our own nights. Geryon is the anxiety of being surrounded, overwhelmed, fighting against versions of the same problem again and again. The birds are the endless distractions, the swarming thoughts that peck and claw until rest feels impossible. Both speak to struggles we know well, those moments when life doesn't throw one challenge at you, but dozens, all at once, until your mind feels like it's splitting. And the ancients lived with those fears daily. Bandits in the hills, disease that spread like wings in the night, armies that descended in multitudes. How else to explain it? But as monsters, they were the language people used to talk about being outnumbered, overpowered, or torn apart. Monsters were metaphors. Yes, but to those who whispered about them by firelight, they were also warnings. Don't wander too far. Don't forget how fragile you really are. If Typhon was chaos at a cosmic scale, and Echidna was the mother of endless nightmares, then these forgotten beasts were chaos made personal. Not the end of the world, just the end of your world. And that, in some ways, is even scarier, because you don't have to imagine a thunder god falling from the sky. You only have to imagine yourself, alone in a forest, hearing the beat of metal wings closing in. So let the night soften that thought. The birds are gone. Geryon has fallen. The quiet has returned. Your battles tonight are only in dreams, and they can't touch you here. But not all monsters were meant to destroy. Some existed to guard, to keep balance, to remind mortals and gods alike where the line was drawn. That's where we find Cerberus, the Hound of Hades. He wasn't the kind of beast that terrorized villages or roamed the countryside. He didn't chase heroes down back alleys or feast on terrified travelers. No, Cerberus had one job, and he did it perfectly to keep the living out of the underworld and the dead from ever escaping it. Picture the gates of Hades, black stone looming against a sky with no sun. Across the river Styx, the boatman ferries shades in silence, coins still clutched in their mouths. And there, waiting at the threshold, is Cerberus' 3 heads, each one alert, each one watching a different direction. Some poets swore he had 50 heads, others said 100, but the image that lasted was 3, past, present, future, birth, life, death, a trinity of watchfulness that no mortal could slip past. His mane bristled with snakes, his eyes glowed like lanterns in the dark, and his tail was said to be a serpent itself. He wasn't chaos incarnate like Typhon or temptation like Echidna. He was order-given fangs. But here's the hook that makes him fascinating. Cerberus wasn't cruel. He wasn't malicious. He never hunted souls that didn't try to flee. He was the boundary. And in the Greek world, boundaries mattered more than anything. They believed in balanced souls where they didn't belong. Mortals who cheated death was more dangerous than death itself. That's why heroes who faced Cerberus often didn't kill him. They soothed him, tricked him, or negotiated with him. Orpheus didn't lift a sword, he strummed his lyre, pouring his grief into music so haunting that Cerberus lay down, lulled by the sound. Psyche didn't fight, she brought honey cakes, tossing them gently to his waiting mouths. Even Hercules, tasked with dragging Cerberus into the light as one of his 12 labours, wrestled him bare-handed, refusing to wound him. Because how do you kill something that isn't your enemy, but the very rules holding the universe together? That's where Cerberus feels so different. He shows us that monsters weren't always villains. Sometimes they were guardians, loyal and unyielding, and in that, there's something almost comforting. Even Hades himself, lord of the underworld, was often depicted with Cerberus at his side, not chained, not whipped, but resting calmly like any loyal dog at his master's feet. Imagine that the most terrifying watchdog in myth, just sitting quietly, doing his duty. Maybe that's why his story still resonates, because we all know what it feels like to face a gate we can't pass, a rule we can't break, a truth we can't escape. We all have Cerberus moments, the boundaries that remind us where our power ends. Sometimes that's heartbreaking, like Orpheus losing Eurydice when he looked back. Sometimes it's humbling, like Hercules realizing brute strength doesn't always mean domination. And sometimes it's simple, like Psyche learning that gentleness opens more doors than violence. In the end, Cerberus isn't the monster who devours you in the night. He's the one who stands watch while you sleep, keeping the chaos where it belongs. And tonight, as you breathe deeper, imagine him there, not snarling, not attacking, just sitting quietly at the edge of your dreams, making sure nothing unwanted slips through. The gate is closed, the guardian is awake, and you're safe. But if Cerberus was the boundary you couldn't cross, the Hydra was the problem you couldn't kill. She lived in the marshes of Lerna, where the water stank of rot and the air was heavy with the buzz of unseen insects. The people said she was ancient, older than the swamps themselves. A coil of hunger and hatred that spread poison with every breath. From her body sprouted not one head but many, writhing and snapping, each one armed with fangs that dripped venom so potent it scorched the earth. Her scales glistened slick and dark, her eyes burned red in the fog, and her presence alone turned the swamp into a wasteland. To wander too close was death not quick, but slow, your blood thickening, your lungs collapsing, until you became another story whispered around the fire. When Heracles was sent to kill her, it wasn't glory that weighed on his shoulders, but despair. He had faced lions, boars, even rivers heaving with impossible labour, but nothing compared to the Hydra. Every time he swung his blade and severed a head, two more sprouted from the bleeding stump. He hacked and hacked, sweat pouring, muscles screaming, and still the monster only grew stronger. Imagine that frustration. The harder you fight, the worse it gets. That was the Hydra's true terror. She was escalation embodied, a battle you could never win by sheer force. And here's where the story shifts. Heracles wasn't alone. His nephew Aeolus stood by, watching the hopeless cycle unfold, and in that desperation came a spark of cleverness. As Heracles cut, Aeolus brought fire, searing the wounds shut, preventing the heads from multiplying. Together they turned futility into progress, until the Hydra shrieked in agony, her many voices echoing across the swamp. At last, only the immortal head remained, and Heracles severed it, burying it beneath a massive stone where it could no longer harm anyone. But the story doesn't end there. Heracles dipped his arrows in the Hydra's venom, carrying her poison into every battle that followed. That's the chilling part. The monster's death didn't erase her power. It spread it. Her blood clung to him like a curse, turning victories into tragedies. Later, it was that same poison, smeared onto a cloak, that burnt him alive. The Hydra may have died in the swamp, but she never really left him. There's something uncomfortably familiar about this, because who hasn't faced a Hydra in their own life? The kind of problem that multiplies the harder you fight debts that double. Lies that spiral, stress that grows every time you try to cut it back. You strike at one head, and two more appear, until it feels like you're drowning in a swamp of your own making, and like Heracles, you realize strength alone isn't enough. You need strategy, you need allies, you need fire. The Greeks didn't just fear the Hydra because of her teeth or her venom. They feared her because she told the truth about life, that some battles are unwinnable if you keep fighting them the same way. That escalation is its own kind of monster, and that even if you succeed, you may carry the scars or the poison long after the fight is over. So let the marsh grow quiet now. The air is clear, the buzzing has faded, the heads lie still. For tonight, there are no multiplying problems, no endless battles, just your breath, steady and calm, rising and falling like a tide that no monster can break. But the swamp wasn't the only place where nightmares burned into the earth. Travel east to the rugged hills of Lycia, and you'd see something strange, fire bleeding straight out of the rocks. No torches, no tricks, just flames licking the air from the ground itself, eternal and unquenchable. The ancients stood before those fires, unable to explain them, and gave them a name, the breath of the Chimera. She was an impossible thing, stitched together from creatures that never should have met. A lion for the front, fierce and proud, its mane bristling like flames, a goat's body sprouting from her back, bleating with a grotesque life of its own, and from her tail, a serpent, hissing and spitting venom into the dust. 3 animals, 3 instincts, fused into one shape that broke the rules of nature. And if that wasn't enough, she breathed fire, a furnace roaring from her throat, scorching earth and flesh alike. It's easy to dismiss her as fantasy, but to the Greeks, the Chimera explained the unexplainable. Why did the hills breathe fire? Because something monstrous lived beneath them. Why did misfortune feel like it came from every direction at once? Because the Chimera attacked with more than one face. She wasn't just a beast, she was disorder incarnate. The horror of things that didn't fit together yet somehow thrived. Enter Bellerophon, the hero chosen or cursed to kill her. Armed with a spear and riding the winged horse Pegasus, he soared above her, looking down at the patchwork abomination below. Face her on the ground, and she would have torn him to pieces. One head would bite, another would gore, another would strike from behind. It was a fight no man could win, but from the air he saw a different path. He jammed a block of lead onto his spear, dove down through the smoke, and rammed it into her flaming throat. Her own fire melted the lead, choking her from the inside, suffocating her in a storm of heat and smoke. The chimera died, but the fire on those hills never went out, and that's the part that sticks. The monster was gone. But her breath still burns today in Lycia, even now, in modern Turkey. Travellers can visit the eternal flames of Mount Chimera, where the ground exhales fire like a living thing. The myth outlived the monster because the fear it carried was real. And here's the twist: the chimera wasn't just about fear of beasts. She was about fear of mixtures, the unease that comes when boundaries blur. The Greeks were obsessed with categories: man, woman, god, beast, life, death. Anything that broke those rules was dangerous. A creature that was all of them at once was unbearable. And don't we still feel that? Think of how unsettled people get when things don't fit the boxes they've built. Cultures mixing, technologies colliding, identities that don't sit neatly in one place. The chimera is that discomfort turned monstrous. But if you look closely, she also carries a lesson. Bellerophon didn't beat her with brute strength. He used her own fire against her. He adapted. And isn't that what survival still requires? When chaos feels stitched together from too many directions, sometimes the only way through is to turn the storm back on itself. So let the flames cool in your mind. The hills are dark now, the air calm, the goat silent, the serpent gone. The lion's roar fades into nothing more than a whisper on the wind. For tonight, there are no patchwork monsters, only the steady warmth of your breath, rising and falling, safe and whole. And then there was Medusa, the woman whose face could turn the world to stone. Most monsters roared or clawed or burned, but she didn't need any of that. One glance, and you were frozen forever, caught mid-breath, mid-thought, your body betraying you in an instant. It's no wonder her story lasted longer than almost any other. But here's the thing. The more you look at Medusa, the less monstrous she becomes. She wasn't born with snakes for hair. In some of the earlier stories, Medusa was just a mortal woman, beautiful enough to draw the eye of Poseidon himself, and that was her curse. In Athena's temple, where no god or man was meant to desecrate, Poseidon forced himself upon her. For that violation, Medusa wasn't protected, she was punished. Athena, goddess of wisdom, of strategy, of justice, turned her into something unrecognizable: scales instead of skin, serpents instead of curls, eyes that carried death. Imagine that a victim made into a monster, exiled from her own humanity. The Greeks told it as a warning, but if you listen closely, it sounds like something darker, the gods covering their shame by rewriting the story. And yet, even as she was cast out, Medusa became powerful. No man could touch her. No army could march against her. She lived on the edges of the world, and the world was terrified of her. When Perseus was sent to kill her, it wasn't heroism, it was politics. A king wanted her head as a trophy, a weapon to wield. Perseus couldn't even face her directly. He had to use a polished shield, catching her reflection to strike the fatal blow. He severed her head, and from her blood sprang Pegasus, the winged horse. Think about that even in death. She gave birth to wonder. Her head didn't disappear with her body. It became the Gorgonean, strapped to shields, carved into temples, worn as jewelry. Soldiers carried it not to destroy but to protect. Believing her petrifying gaze could ward off evil, the victim was remade into a guardian, her horror recycled into power. And isn't that how history works? The stories of women, especially women wronged, twisted until they serve someone else's purpose. But Medusa endures because she speaks to something deeper than myth. She is every story where pain is turned against the one who suffered it. She's every whisper of blame shifted onto the victim, every punishment disguised as justice, and yet she's also defiance. Today, her imagery appears not as a monster but as a symbol of survival. Artists carve her into statues that don't terrify but inspire. Feminists wear her face as armor, reclaiming what the gods once tried to erase. Even the fashion house Versace chose her head as a logo, a reminder that beauty and danger can coexist, inseparable. The Greeks wanted her story to end with silence, with death. Instead, she became louder in absence. That's her real power, the ability to transcend the version told about her and become something else entirely. Not villain, not victim, but icon. So tonight, let her eyes soften in your imagination. The snakes coil gently, resting, their hiss no more than a whisper like rain. Her gaze isn't meant to petrify you, but to shield you, standing watch at the edge of your dreams. For once, Medusa doesn't take life, she protects it. And under that protection, you can breathe, close your eyes, and sleep. And if Medusa was terror distilled into a single glance, then Scylla and Charybdis were terror stretched across an entire horizon. Picture yourself on a creaking wooden ship, the salt spray stinging your eyes, the oars groaning with every stroke. The straight ahead narrows to a throat of stone, cliffs looming high on both sides. The wind hisses, the current claws at the hull, and your crew is already whispering the names no sailor wants to hear. On the right, Scylla. On the left, Charybdis. Two nightmares waiting, and the cruelest truth of all, you can't avoid both. Scylla clung to her cliffside cave, a shape half hidden in the shadows. From her waist sprouted long and sinewy legs like a spider's, clawing into the rock, 6 necks uncoiled from her body, each ending in a snapping head filled with triple rows of jagged teeth. Her voice, Homer said, was like the whine of hungry puppies, a sound that tricked sailors into pity until it was too late. She didn't sink ships with storms or fire. She simply reached down and plucked men from the deck, one for each head, dragging them screaming into the dark. Her cruelty was precise, predictable 6 lives, every time. Charybdis, on the other hand, was chaos unmeasured. She lurked beneath the waves, a maw so vast she could swallow the sea itself. 3 times a day she sucked the water down, pulling ships into her spiral, grinding wood and bone alike into splinters before spewing it all back out in a geyser of foam and wreckage. To drift too close to her side was to lose everything, no survivors, no bargains, just annihilation. Odysseus faced this choice, guided by Circe's grim advice. Steer toward Scylla, she said, and lose 6 men. Steer toward Charybdis, and risk them all. Imagine holding the tiller in your hands, knowing that every tug sealed fates. Odysseus chose Scylla, and as the ship scraped past the cliffs, the monster struck, lifting 6 men into the air, their cries cut short as the sea swallowed them. He watched, helpless, because that was the price of survival. The ancients used this story as a warning. Sometimes life doesn't offer victory, only degrees of loss. Better to sacrifice a few than to lose everything. And doesn't that echo in our own world? Every hard decision, whether in war, in leadership, or even in our personal lives, carries that cruel weight. Which harm do you choose? Which pain do you accept so that something, anything, can continue forward? Scylla and Charybdis still haunt our language. To be between a rock and a hard place is their legacy. And though the sea may be calmer now, the truth they carried remains. No-win choices will always find us. And sometimes the best we can do is steer carefully, grit our teeth, and endure the screams. But tonight, the strait is wide and calm. No cliffs loom overhead, no whirlpool yawns beneath you. The ship glides steady, the crew safe, the sea at peace. The monsters sleep in their caves and currents. You sail forward into silence, the only sound your breath, steady and slow, carrying you toward rest. But some monsters don't live in storms or oceans. Some live in the walls we build ourselves, deep in the heart of a Crete, in a palace so vast it felt like a trap. The Minotaur waited. He wasn't a storm, or a serpent, or a goddess's curse. He was a boy once born of a queen, and a divine deception, reshaped into something the world could not bear to see, half man, half bull. He paced the stone corridors of the labyrinth, his hooves echoing through the endless halls, a prisoner of his own existence. The story began with King Minos, who promised Poseidon he would sacrifice a bull to honor him. But when the god sent a magnificent white bull from the sea, Minos kept it for himself. The punishment wasn't thunder or lightning, but desire twisted against him. His wife, Pasiphae, was cursed to fall in love with the bull, and from that union came the Minotaur, a child neither fully human nor fully beast. Imagine the shame that must have rippled through the court, the whispered rumours, the disgust. Minos did not kill the boy. Instead, he hid him, ordering the craftsman Daedalus to build a labyrinth so complex no one who entered could ever leave. And so the Minotaur grew up in shadows, fed not on love but on sacrifices 7 boys and 7 girls sent from Athens every 9 years, tributes demanded as penance for a past defeat. Those children walked into the labyrinth, trembling, their footsteps swallowed by silence, knowing they would never see daylight again. And somewhere in the dark, the Minotaur waited, hungry, doomed to play his part. When Theseus volunteered to end the horror, it wasn't just bravery. It was a rebellion against the cruelty of tradition, against the idea that some debts must always be paid in blood. Ariadne, Minos' daughter, gave him a thread of wool, a lifeline to guide him back out. Theseus entered, blade in hand, and found the beast. The fight wasn't a clash of equals. It was the collision of myth and misery. Theseus struck, and the Minotaur fell, the labyrinth echoing with the sound of hooves collapsing on stone. But listen closer, and the story isn't so simple. The Minotaur wasn't just a monster. He was a child born into shame, hidden away until he became exactly what people feared. A boy turned into a weapon, then into a curse. His existence tells us something the Greeks understood too well, that the monsters we fear most are often the ones we create ourselves. And maybe that's why the labyrinth matters more than the beast. The twisting halls, the endless corridors, they weren't just stone. They were memory, guilt, trauma. Every turn was a reminder of something hidden, something buried, something you couldn't face head on. We all have labyrinths inside us, the places where we wall off the things we don't want to remember. The Minotaur is what waits at the center. The shame, the fear, the grief we try to hide until it grows teeth. Even Theseus didn't leave the story unscarred. He abandoned Ariadne, the woman who saved him, on a lonely island. He forgot to change the sails from black to white, and when his father saw the dark sails returning, he hurled himself into the sea. Victory came, but it was soaked in betrayal and grief. That's the labyrinth's final lesson. Even when you escape, you leave something behind. So let the maze grow quiet now. No hooves echo, no thread unwinds. The halls dissolve into stillness, and the monster at the center rests. Tonight, there are no corridors to lose yourself in, only the steady rhythm of your breath, carrying you out of the dark and into peace. Imagine sitting at a table, heavy with food, bread still steaming, roasted meats dripping with fat, bowls of figs and olives glistening in the torchlight. You reach for a cup, your stomach twisting with hunger, when the air tears open with a scream, a rush of wind, a blur of feathers, and the feast vanishes before your fingers can even close around it. What's left is filth, spoiled scraps, foul stench, a banquet transformed into rot. That was the torment of Phineus, the blind prophet cursed to starve in the middle of abundance, hounded by the Harpies. The Harpies weren't grand, dragon-like beasts. They were winged women with clawed hands, faces twisted into sneers, and wings that beat like thunder when they descended. Their name meant snatchers, and that's exactly what they did, stealing food, stealing peace, stealing dignity. To the Greeks, they were storm winds made flesh, sudden and violent, leaving nothing behind but wreckage. They didn't kill Phineus. That would have been mercy. They humiliated him, swooping down at every meal, shrieking in his ears, poisoning what little they left. The cruelty wasn't in death, but in denial and endless hunger sharpened by the knowledge that food was always just out of reach. The Argonauts, on their quest for the golden fleece, stumbled into his misery. They watched the Harpies strike, their wings blotting out the sun, their talons ripping through meat, their screeches shaking the walls, and 2 of the Argonauts winged themselves the sons of Boreas. The north wind rose into the air to chase them. The clash filled the sky with feathers and fury, Harpies fleeing toward the sea, driven back only when the rainbow goddess Iris appeared, promising they would never torment Phineus again. Relief, at last. But at a cost the image of terror never truly left him. And maybe that's the detail that lingers. The Harpies weren't titans toppling gods. They were humiliation given wings. They embodied that gnawing feeling of being cheated, of life dangling something in front of you only to snatch it away at the last second. Who hasn't felt that? The opportunity lost, the effort spoiled, the meal you thought was yours stolen by bad luck or cruelty. The Harpies remind us that sometimes suffering isn't about great battles. It's about the 1,000 small denials that eat away at us, piece by piece, until despair feels normal. Yet, even in their spite, the Harpies carried a strange truth. They forced Phineas to share his visions with the Argonauts, guiding them through dangers he could never face alone. Out of torment came wisdom. Out of humiliation came a map for heroes. It doesn't make the cruelty right, but it shows how the Greeks understood suffering not as random, but as something that carves lessons into flesh. So let the wind calm now. No wings beat above your head, no shrieks split the air. The feast is untouched, the table steady, and for once, nothing is stolen. Tonight, the Harpies sleep, and in their silence, you can rest too. The dining hall of Phineas fades into silence, the shrieking wings of the Harpies gone, leaving only the hollow echo of hunger. But the Greeks knew that torment didn't vanish with the flap of wings. Some horrors lived closer to the bone, tied not to storms or famine, but to the very fabric of justice itself. That's where the Furies come in the Erinyes, as the ancients called them. They weren't punishers of random men or monsters that hunted at will. They were far worse. They were the vengeance of the earth itself, birthed from blood and outrage, relentless, incorruptible, merciless. The story begins with a crime so raw it carved itself into myth. Uranus, the sky, was overthrown by his son Cronus, who cut him down with a sickle of flint. As Uranus fell, his blood spattered across the body of Gaia, the earth, seeping deep into her soil. From that wound, from that mingling of pain and fury, the Furies were born, not gods, not mortals, but something older, darker. Their eyes burned like coals, their hair writhed with serpents, their hands dripped with whips and torches. They had no throne on Olympus, no golden halls. They lived in shadows and caves, emerging only when a crime cried too loudly to be ignored. And their jurisdiction was absolute. They punished blood guilt. Murder within families, sons killing mothers, mothers killing sons, brothers turning on brothers. It wasn't that other killings were free of consequence, but kinslaying tore at the deepest bond of Greek society, the one thing even gods treated with caution. When that line was crossed, when blood betrayed blood, the Furies came, and there was no appeal, no plea, no escape. Imagine them descending wings, unfurling like storm clouds, eyes wide and unblinking, their voices a chorus of curses. They didn't seduce, they didn't roar, they whispered, hissed, screamed in tones that drilled into bone. A killer could flee across seas, across kingdoms, across generations, but the Furies never stopped. They were the weight of guilt given form, hounds that ran faster than time, shadows that followed into every dream. Sleep offered no refuge, food turned to ash, breath itself became a burden. That was their punishment, not just death, but the unravelling of life from the inside out. One of the most famous stories of their wrath was Orestes. His father, Agamemnon, returned from the Trojan War only to be murdered in his bath by his wife, Clytemnestra, and her lover Aegisthus. The betrayal was brutal, intimate, carried out in the very home he had longed to return to. Orestes, their son, was torn between loyalties, avenge his father or honour his mother. The gods themselves pushed him. Apollo whispered in his ear, "Kill her or live dishonoured," and so Orestes did, plunging the blade into his mother, silencing her once and for all. But in that act, he crossed the one boundary he could never undo: matricide. The moment her body hit the floor, the Furies stirred. They rose from the earth, black wings filling the sky, their cries like iron grinding against stone. They descended on Orestes, tearing at his mind, chasing him through temples, across cities, through the very fabric of Greece. He staggered from shrine to shrine, begging for mercy, but the Furies could not be bribed or soothed. Not even Apollo could drive them away. They clung to him, their eyes burning holes in his sanity, until he fell to the ground trembling, begging for death. It was only Athena, goddess of wisdom, who finally offered something different. She convened the first trial in myth, a court in Athens where Orestes would stand judged not by gods or vengeance, but by reason, argument, law. The jury was split, half guilty, half innocent. Athena cast the deciding vote for mercy, absolving him of his crime, and in that moment, something shifted. The Furies, once relentless, were persuaded barely to transform. They were given a new role as the Eumenides, the kindly ones, guardians of justice within the framework of law rather than raw vengeance. But think about that. Even the Greeks, who invented gods for wine and seas and dawn, couldn't tame the idea of vengeance without rewriting the rules of the universe. The Furies had to be given new names, new temples, a new identity just to contain them, because vengeance that never ends justice without mercy is a force too destructive even for Olympus. And here's the part that makes them timeless. The Furies weren't just monsters in a story. They were conscience before conscience had a name. They were guilt, clawing at you when no one else saw what you did. They were the voice that kept you awake, replaying the act again and again, whispering, "You can't undo this. You can't escape." We still know that voice. It's in the insomniac staring at the ceiling at 3 a.m., replaying choices they can't take back. It's in the leader haunted by the cost of a decision, the parent haunted by words they wish they hadn't said. The Furies live on because guilt lives on. In a way, they were more terrifying than any dragon or serpent. You can kill a serpent. You can outwit a sphinx. You can even bury a hydra's immortal head under a stone. But you can't outrun yourself. The Furies reminded the Greeks and remind us that punishment doesn't always come from outside. Sometimes it rises from within, carried in our blood, etched into our bones. And yet, there's a strange comfort buried in their story. Because when Athena offered Orestes trial instead of torment, when the Furies accepted the role of Eumenides, it wasn't just a myth about gods. It was the birth of a radical idea that justice could be something other than revenge, that mercy could exist beside punishment, that the cycle of blood for blood could, maybe, end. For us, that feels painfully modern. We still argue about justice. Should it be harsh, absolute, merciless? Or should it bend, consider, weigh, and forgive? The Furies stand on one side of that argument, Athena on the other, and humanity caught between them. Now, picture them not as dusty relics, but as shadows still moving at the edge of our world. Every protest chant demanding retribution, every courtroom echo, every private torment in the dead of night, they're there. Their wings brush past us, unseen but felt, whenever rage hardens into righteousness. So breathe with me now. The trial is over, the jury is gone, the courtroom is silent, the Furies fold their wings, their serpents quiet, their torches dim. Tonight they will not chase you. They will not tear your dreams. They will stand instead at the edges, not as tormentors, but as guardians. Their justice sleeps, and in that silence, so can you. The Furies never simply vanished after the trial of Orestes. Their shadows bled into every corner of Greek imagination, lingering like smoke after a fire. Athens gave them a temple, yes, and a softer name. But names alone can't kill what people fear. The truth was simpler and more haunting even when the gods tried to tame them. The Erinyes still lived inside human stories, reminding mortals that blood is never shed without echo. Think of how the Greeks built their cities. Marble columns, theatres, marketplaces alive with voices. But beneath it all lay the memory of violence wars against neighbours, betrayals within families, feuds that lasted generations. The Furies weren't creatures of the countryside like centaurs or satyrs. They belonged in the city, in the courts, in the whispered gossip about who murdered whom. Their presence hung like a storm cloud over every oath. Break a promise sworn in the name of the gods, and it wasn't Zeus's thunderbolt you feared. It was the silent approach of wings in the dark. Their power extended even into birth. Women in labour prayed they would not attract the Erinyes, for childbirth was blood, and blood could stir them. Soldiers who returned from war carried offerings to appease them, hoping the blood spilled on foreign soil would not summon vengeance back home. They were more than punishers. They were regulators of balance, ensuring that even gods could not act without consequence. Aeschylus, the great tragedian, knew this well. In his play Eumenides, the final of the Oresteia trilogy, he portrayed them not as grotesque harpies, but as ancient, grave, terrifying in their persistence. On stage, actors wore dark robes, snakes in their hair, their chants filling the theatre with a rhythm that struck deeper than words. The audience sat in silence, not because they were entertained, but because they recognized themselves. Everyone had something to fear. Everyone had a shadow the Furies could chase. What made them terrifying wasn't just their vengeance, it was their incorruptibility. The Olympian gods could be bribed, flattered, tricked. Zeus could be distracted by beauty. Hera manipulated by jealousy. Poseidon swayed by sacrifice. But the Furies, they could not be bought. They did not care about flattery or wealth. They answered only to blood and oath, and that made them unshakable. In a world where everything felt negotiable, the Furies were absolute. And yet their absoluteness was double-edged. The Greeks both feared and needed them. Without them, crime might go unpunished. With them, punishment never ended. That paradox sits at the heart of justice even now. How do you balance mercy with accountability? When is enough blood enough? Consider the story of Alecto, one of the three named Erinyes. Her name meant unceasing anger. In later Roman retellings, she appears in Virgil's Aeneid, sent by Juno to drive Queen Amata into a frenzy, sparking the war between Latins and Trojans. Alecto didn't wield swords or claws. She whispered. She poisoned thoughts, ignited fears, turned suspicion into madness. Her weapon was the human mind, and in that, she feels less like a myth and more like a timeless archetype. Who hasn't known the whisper that won't let you rest? The rage that grows with every retelling of a slight Alecto was fury not from the outside, but from within. Unrelenting and corrosive. Megaera, the jealous one, punished betrayal and infidelity. Tisiphone, the avenger of murder, specialized in family bloodshed. Each Fury had her domain, her specialty, her wound she pressed until it bled again. Together they formed a trinity of relentless justice, a system without loopholes. If the Olympians were government, the Furies were the underground current of law, silent but inescapable. And maybe that's why their transformation into the Eumenides was both necessary and uneasy. The Athenians built them a sanctuary beneath the Areopagus, the hill of Ares, where the city's highest court met. Citizens left offerings honey, black sheep, prayers spoken in trembling voices. They didn't honor the Furies with feasts or festivals, but with fear disguised as reverence. Call them kindly ones, but never forget the truth their kindness was conditional, born from restraint, never nature. The psychology here is chilling. Imagine living with the knowledge that every betrayal, every act of violence against your own blood could awaken forces you could not see. It kept families bound in fear, yes, but also in accountability. Parents feared their children, children feared their parents, brothers feared each other. Blood was both bond and curse. The Furies embodied that dread. Fast forward to us, and the Furies are still with us, though we don't call them by name. They're the gnawing guilt after a fight you can't take back. They're the voice reminding you of what you did when no one else remembers. They're the unease in societies built on hidden violence, colonialism, slavery, injustice that never quite goes silent. Nations, like people, have Furies that whisper in the dark, demanding recognition. Ignore them, and they grow louder. Confront them, and maybe they transform, but never without leaving scars. The Greeks knew this, even if they didn't say it directly. The Furies weren't villains. They weren't heroes either. They were inevitabilities. That's why their story feels heavier than most myths it doesn't resolve neatly. Orestes found mercy. Yes, but only after years of torment. The Furies accepted a new role, but not because they were defeated, because they were given a seat at the table. Justice required their presence, their perspective, their relentlessness. Without them, law was hollow. With them, law had teeth. And here's the haunting part. Maybe we still need them. Maybe we need voices that refuse to forget. Forces that demand we face what we'd rather bury. Not because vengeance is good, but because memory is necessary. Without memory, without acknowledgement, guilt festers. The Furies remind us that the past is never past until it's reckoned with. So let's not imagine them only in mythic caves. Picture them walking among us, unrecognized. In the courtroom, when a victim's family cries out for justice. In the quiet of your own mind, when regret grips your chest. In the headlines, when old crimes resurface demanding to be heard. Their wings may not be visible, but the sound, the whisper, the rush of air, The relentless pursuit is still there. And as you lie here tonight, hearing this story, you might feel them too. Not as tormentors, not as punishers, but as reminders. Reminders that what we do matters, that bonds cannot be broken without consequence, that justice, whatever form it takes, never sleeps entirely. But for now, in this quiet moment, their wings fold, their voices soften, the serpents rest their heads. Justice will wait until morning. You're safe to close your eyes, carried not by vengeance, but by rest. There are some monsters that live in storms, some in caves, some in the guilt etched into our bloodlines, but others lurk in something far more intimate desire, not the kind that lifts you, not the kind that binds two people in trust, but the kind that blinds, distorts, and consumes. The Greeks feared that hunger too. They gave it faces, names, wings, claws, and two of the most haunting were Lamia and Empusa, creatures not of battlefield terror, but of the bedroom and the cradle, monsters who stole what people valued most when their guard was down. Lamia's story begins with beauty and ends with bitterness. She was said to be a Libyan queen, dazzling in her charm, so striking that even Zeus noticed her. And Zeus's attention was rarely a blessing. He pursued her, and in the way of so many of his conquests, she bore his children. But Hera, relentless in her jealousy, turned her vengeance not on her husband, but on the woman and her offspring. One by one, Lamia's children were stolen or slaughtered, until she was left with empty arms and a heart curdled with grief. In some versions, Hera cursed her to never close her eyes, so she would see their deaths again and again. Imagine that a mother, sleepless, replaying the loss every night, trapped in a loop of mourning. It was grief that twisted her into a monster. Her beauty withered, her body warped, her hunger became something unnatural. The Greeks whispered that she prowled in the night, her eyes wide and unblinking, stealing children from their beds, drinking their blood to fill the emptiness that nothing else could satisfy. In some versions, she could remove her eyes, tucking them away, cursed to see and not see, a grotesque parody of rest. To a Greek mother, the threat of Lamia was more chilling than any titan. Because the war gods might ignore you, the sea might spare you, but Lamia hunted the small and defenseless, the ones who should never have been touched. What makes Lamia terrifying is not just the cruelty of her acts, but the humanity at their core. She was a woman undone by grief, a victim of divine politics, punished for being loved by the wrong god. The Greeks feared her because she revealed something uncomfortable, that sorrow, left to rot, can become monstrous. That love betrayed can turn into a hunger with no bottom. Lamia wasn't an alien terror. She was what happens when someone loses everything and keeps on living anyway, twisted around the absence. Empusa, by contrast, was younger in myth but no less disturbing. She belonged to Hecate, goddess of crossroads and witchcraft, the one who lingered where choices branched and the dead whispered. Empusa was her servant, her daughter. Her shadow accounts vary, but all agree she was a shapeshifter. Her body was grotesque by design, one leg of flesh, the other of bronze. Some said she could appear as a radiant woman, drawing men to her bed, only to devour them in the act. Others said she shifted into beasts, flames, even phantoms, always designed to lure, to seduce, to consume. Travellers told stories of Empusa haunting lonely roads at night, her bronze leg clanging softly on the stones, her laughter echoing in the dark. If you followed her, if you gave in to the gleam of her eyes or the promise of her voice, you were lost. Some later writers suggested she was more illusion than substance, a kind of nightmare conjured to test mortals. But whether she was flesh or phantom, the terror was the same, the body's desires turned against itself. For the Greeks, Empusa carried a warning: beware lust that blinds you. Beware the stranger too beautiful, the pleasure too easy, the offer too convenient. She was every bad choice given supernatural form, every indulgence that ended in regret. Men feared her, yes, but women feared her too, for she represented the double edge of desire, the way society punished women for sexuality even as it feared its power. Together, Lamia and Empusa formed a pair of archetypes. One was the mother-turned-predator, the nurturer inverted into devourer. The other was the temptress, the lover who destroyed rather than fulfilled. They weren't brute force like the Hydra, or puzzles like the Sphinx. They were mirrors of human vulnerability. They attacked not armies but individuals, in the most private, unguarded spaces of life cradles and beds. It's telling how the Greeks spoke of them. Parents used Lamia to frighten children into obedience. Go to bed, or Lamia will come. Men spoke of Empusa in hushed tones, half mocking, half afraid the story you laugh about at the tavern, but glance over your shoulder while walking home in the dark. They were myths, yes, but also social tools, ways to discipline behaviour through fear. But beneath the warnings lies something darker and more empathetic. Lamia is grief embodied, a portrait of what happens when pain curdles into predation. She's not just a bogey woman. She's the echo of every parent who loses a child and feels their love turn into rage at a world that keeps spinning without them. Empusa, too, speaks to something enduring the way societies both desire and demonize women's sexuality, turning attraction into accusation. She wasn't just a monster. She was a scapegoat, a myth designed to carry cultural anxieties. Now picture the psychology. Lamia's sleepless eyes. What is insomnia, if not the punishment of memory? Her hunger for children. What is trauma, if not the urge to replace what was taken? Empusa's shifting shapes. What is temptation, if not the illusion that something new, something different, will finally fill the emptiness? The Greeks didn't just fear these creatures. They feared themselves in them. Even in later centuries, their shadows stretched on. Medieval Europe rebranded Lamia as witches who stole infants, while Empusa's legacy can be found in succubi, demons who drained men in their sleep. The myths changed names, but the core fears remained grief that never ends, desire that devours, and maybe that's why they still resonate today. We don't tell our children Lamia will come, but we still understand the fear of losing them. We don't speak of Empusa on the road, but we still tell stories of temptations that lead to ruin. The monsters evolve, but the human nerves they touch never disappear. Think of the films we watch, the thrillers we write, the grieving mother who becomes the villain, the femme fatale who seduces only to destroy. These are modern Empusas and Lamias, draped in new costumes but carrying the same message: desire is dangerous. Grief is corrosive, and unchecked hunger, whether of body or heart, can consume us all. But tonight, let's soften their shapes. Lamia closes her eyes at last, her sleepless gaze dimming, her hunger silenced. Empusa, restless at the crossroads, fades into mist, her footsteps gone. For once, there are no stolen children, no clanging bronze, no laughter in the dark, only quiet, only rest. So breathe. The night is still, the monsters of desire retreating into myth. Their whispers cannot reach you. You are safe here, untouched, free, sleep. But the shadows around Lamia and Empusa never really ended where the myths seemed to pause. They seeped further, threading themselves into the daily fears of people who had no protection from hunger, sickness, betrayal, or desire. The Greeks gave many monsters teeth and claws, but Lamia and Empusa carried subtler weapons: the gaze, the whisper, the slow unravelling of trust. That was what made them dangerous. They weren't only nightmares told by firelight. They were lessons woven into life. Lamia's curse of sleeplessness strikes hardest when you think about what sleeplessness means. To close your eyes is to heal, to forget, even for a little while. To stay awake endlessly is to be trapped in grief without reprieve. Mothers in ancient Greece sometimes whispered her name when their children would not sleep, warning that Lamia would come for them if they kept crying. But imagine the inverse for Lamia herself. Every child's cry was a dagger. Every sound in the night was the echo of her own loss, multiplied, distorted. Her predation was not random, it was the reflex of someone broken, lashing out in the shape the gods had forced on her. The image of her removing her eyes is especially cruel. Some stories said she could take them out and hide them, giving herself small mercy in the ability not to see. Others said Hera cursed her to keep them open, unable to rest. In both versions, the eyes symbolize something the Greeks understood well, that seeing too much can be as destructive as seeing too little. In a world without anesthetics, without therapy, without reprieve, Lamia embodied the way trauma sticks like thorns under the skin, forcing you to watch again and again the thing you cannot undo. Her appetite for children was not just cruelty, but also metaphor. To the Greeks, Children meant future, continuity, safety. To lose them was to have your line, your hope, your immortality destroyed. Lamia's hunger was a twisted mirror of that truth. When you are robbed of a future, the pain can warp into a need to rob others of theirs. That's what made her terrifying. She was grief weaponized. Empusa, by contrast, fed not on children, but on desire. Her bronze leg clanging on the stones was a warning, a giveaway, yet men still followed her. The Greeks knew that temptation was never quiet. It announced itself, often loudly, but people chose blindness. Empusa's shifting form a beautiful maiden one moment. A beast the next was a dramatization of how lust works. You see what you want until it is too late. She was not simply a seductress. She was the embodiment of regret that comes after indulgence, the realization that the promise was illusion and the cost irreversible. Later storytellers, especially in Roman and Byzantine times, expanded her legend. They claimed she mocked her victims, laughing as they fell, turning her transformations into cruel theatre. She became not only a predator but a performer, playing on the weakness of others for her amusement. In that, Empusa became less about hunger and more about control, the terror that someone else could puppeteer your desires, make a fool of you, and leave you emptied. But both Lamia and Empusa share something deeper. They reveal how the Greeks used monsters to talk about women. Lamia was a mother destroyed, turned into a predator because her grief had no outlet. Empusa was a lover twisted, a warning against women's sexuality unbound by marriage or family. These stories weren't just about fear of the supernatural. They were about fear of women themselves, fear of their bodies, their desires, their grief. The myths turned those fears into nightmares, making women into scapegoats for the chaos men couldn't control. Even so, the myths sometimes betray sympathy. Some fragments hint that Lamia's story was told with pity, that her monstrous form was as much tragedy as terror. And in some depictions, Empusa was more prankster than killer, a mischievous spirit testing mortals rather than destroying them. These contradictions matter. They show that the Greeks weren't just inventing villains. They were wrestling with truths too complicated to name outright. Grief is unbearable, desire is dangerous, and both can twist even the best of us into something unrecognizable. The echoes of Lamia spread wide. In medieval Europe, she became part of witchcraft lore, folded into tales of women who drank the blood of infants or poisoned children in their sleep. She was invoked to explain crib death, famine, sudden loss. In the Renaissance, poets wrote of Lamias as beautiful seductresses who lured men before consuming them, merging her legend with Empusa's. By the time the Romantics took hold of her, she was transformed again, sometimes tragic, sometimes demonic, always a figure at the edge of comfort. Empusa's legacy travelled differently. She morphed into the succubus of medieval demonology, the nightmare lover who pressed onto men in the dark, draining their life. And in folklore, her footsteps became the template for countless spirits who haunted lonely roads, testing whether travellers could resist temptation. She even appears in Shakespeare's Comedy of Errors, invoked as a symbol of madness and fear. Empusa never really left. She simply changed costumes, keeping her clanging bronze foot just out of sight. And the psychology of them still works. Lamia's hunger is grief turned outward. Empusa's seduction is desire turned against itself. We recognize these patterns in modern life. We talk about toxic relationships, about people who consume others because they cannot fill their own emptiness. We talk about self-destructive desire, the rush toward pleasure that leaves only emptiness. These aren't new ideas, they're old truths dressed in new words. The Greeks simply carved them into the shapes of women with serpents and bronze legs. There's also the social element. Myths of Lamia and Empusa taught boundaries. Children were told not to wander alone, men not to trust strange women, women not to give in to grief or rage. They were morality tales, yes, but also reflections of how society sought to control what it feared: women's independence, sexuality, and sorrow. Monsters were how the Greeks said, don't step outside the role we've given you. But in making those monsters unforgettable, they also revealed how fragile those boundaries were. And maybe that's the haunting lesson for us. What if Lamia isn't just a monster? What if she's what happens when grief is ignored, when injustice is left to fester? What if Empusa isn't just a temptress, but a mirror of our own contradictions, our simultaneous craving and condemnation of desire? The myths may have punished them, but they also preserved them. Their names endured because they spoke truths the culture couldn't silence. So as the night deepens, imagine them differently for a moment. Lamia, no longer hunting, finally holding the children she lost, her eyes closing at last. Empusa, no longer clanging down the road, simply standing at the crossroads, watching silently as travellers choose their own paths. Perhaps monsters don't vanish. Perhaps they soften when we understand what they were trying to tell us all along. And in that softness, let the fear dissolve. No footsteps on the road, no cries in the night, only the hush of quiet breath. Steady, calm. Lamia sleeps, Empusa fades. Desire rests, grief quiets, and you are safe here, untouched. Cassandra's voice broke the silence of Troy long before the city itself broke. She stood on the high walls, her hair tangled with salt and ash, her eyes wide, not with madness but with knowledge. She saw the ships on the horizon before others even believed they were coming. She saw the wooden horse as a trap while her people cheered it as a gift. She saw her brothers dead before they left the gates, her father's city burning while it still gleamed in gold. And the cruelest part was this: she told the truth. Every word, every warning, and no one listened. Her curse was not blindness, but clarity without trust. Apollo had loved her once, or at least wanted her. He gave her the gift of prophecy, a sight deeper than eyes, a voice tuned to the threads of fate. But when she rejected him, when she chose herself over a god's desire, he twisted the gift into torment. She would always speak the truth, but no one would ever believe her. Imagine that your voice, perfectly accurate, stripped of all weight, your words, doomed to be dismissed as delusion. It wasn't madness, it was erasure. And isn't that its own kind of monster? Not a beast of fangs or fire, but a condition that rots you from the inside. To see everything clearly and carry the burden of knowing you can't stop it. To be dismissed, mocked, ignored, until your voice feels like poison in your own throat. For the Greeks, Cassandra embodied a terror more insidious than any hydra, the terror of being right and alone. Think of her during the fall of Troy. She begged them not to bring the wooden horse inside the walls. She clawed at the doors of the temples, screamed herself hoarse while her people laughed. She even struck the horse with an axe, desperate to prove it hollow, but no one cared. They looked at her with pity, the way people do when they've decided you're broken. That's the tragedy. She wasn't disbelieved because she lied. She was disbelieved because she was inconvenient. To trust her would mean admitting danger, admitting fear, admitting they'd already lost. So they silenced her with mockery, and in that silence they destroyed themselves. When the city fell, Cassandra's visions didn't stop. She saw the Greeks storming the walls, the slaughter in the streets, the temples desecrated. She clung to Athena's statue, praying for mercy. But even that sanctuary was shattered. Ajax the Lesser dragged her from the goddess's feet, an act so violent it offended even the gods, staining the Greek victory with sacrilege. From Troy she was taken as a prize, given to Agamemnon as a concubine, her voice still whispering truth in a world that mocked her. She told him his wife, Clytemnestra, would kill him the moment he returned home. He laughed it off, ignored her warnings, and walked straight into his own murder. Cassandra was cut down beside him, her prophecy once again fulfilled in blood, her voice silenced not by disbelief but by death. The Greeks feared her not just because of her words, but because of what she represented. She was the embodiment of ignored truth, and deep down, they knew they ignored truth all the time. They ignored the omens when it was inconvenient, ignored the cost of war when glory called louder, ignored the cries of the powerless when power demanded silence. Cassandra was the mirror they didn't want to face, the reminder that truth is often sacrificed first in the pursuit of comfort. There's a psychological monster here, one that still stalks us. Call it the Cassandra complex. As modern thinkers have the torment of knowing what's coming and being dismissed, scientists warning of climate collapse, doctors warning of pandemics, whistleblowers exposing corruption, all carrying her curse. Their voices often ring clear, their evidence undeniable, and yet they're treated as alarmists until the disaster arrives. Cassandra isn't just a character in myth. She's a pattern, a cycle we keep repeating. And think of the toll it takes. To be Cassandra is to live in a world where your truth becomes isolation. Every conversation, every plea, met with rolled eyes or nervous laughter. Eventually, your words lose their power not because they're wrong, but because you've been labeled as wrong. You start to question yourself. You start to wonder if silence is easier. That's the final cruelty of the curse, not that others stop listening, but that you start doubting whether speaking matters at all. The Greeks called her a prophetess, but we could call her something else, the first ghost of gaslighting. Her reality was denied again and again until she was forced to live in the gap between what she knew and what everyone else insisted was true. That gap is a haunting place. It gnaws at your sanity. It makes you question whether you're the monster, whether the visions in your head are the curse itself rather than the truth they contain. Her death beside Agamemnon is usually told as the end of her story. But I think the more haunting ending is this: even as she fell, her visions were still true, even in her silence. The curse lived on. She became less a character and more a symbol of the futility of foresight in a world that prefers ignorance. And maybe that's why her story endures. We still live in cities that laugh at their own prophets. We still build wooden horses and call them gifts, even when the warnings echo from the walls. The Greeks saw Cassandra as both victim and monster. Victim because she suffered endlessly. Monster because she carried knowledge no one wanted. She didn't breathe fire or sprout wings, but her presence poisoned comfort, stripped illusions bare. That was terrifying enough, because sometimes the worst monster is the one who tells you the truth you don't want to hear. Imagine her voice now, carried across the centuries, whispering to us, listen. Not because she needs to be right, but because ignoring truth always has the same ending: collapse, ruin, loss. That's the thread that ties her to Lamia, to Empusa, to all the monsters before her. Each one carries a lesson wrapped in terror, and Cassandra's lesson is clear: the future doesn't care if you believe it. It comes anyway, so as the night deepens, let her stand at the edge of your dreams, not screaming, not cursed, just waiting. Her eyes soft, her voice steady, her words finally heard. For once, you can listen without fear. For once, the truth doesn't have to burn. Arachne's fingers moved faster than thought, faster than speech, faster than the eyes of anyone watching could follow. She wove stories into cloth, colours into truth, threads into revelations no tongue dared speak aloud. And that was her power, her curse. Not prophecy like Cassandra, not visions of the future, but memory of the present sharpened into accusation. With every loom strike, with every shuttle's pass, she told the truths no one wanted hanging in daylight. She wasn't a goddess, or a queen, or even a priestess. She was a mortal woman in Lydia, a weaver's daughter, whose skill outstripped every teacher, until people whispered her work could only be divine. Cloaks that shimmered like fire, gowns that rippled like water, tapestries that seemed to breathe. Her art wasn't just beauty, it was clarity. She depicted what others dared not. She gave shape to the world's hypocrisies, stitching them into form for all to see. And in that way, she too became a kind of prophet, though her visions were made not of words but of threads. It was pride, some said, that drew Athena's attention. The goddess of wisdom, of crafts, of strategy, could not bear a mortal outshining her. But others say it wasn't arrogance at all, it was honesty. Arachne's tapestries showed the gods not as noble rulers but as tricksters, deceivers, violators. She wove scenes of Zeus disguised as swan and bull, seducing or assaulting mortal women. She wove Poseidon's violence, Apollo's broken promises, Dionysus's drunken cruelties. The gods, rendered in thread, looked all too human in their corruption, and that, more than skill, was the offence. Arachne didn't just weave, she exposed. Athena disguised herself as an old woman, warning Arachne to repent, to give the gods their due, to cloak her skill in humility. But Arachne, confident and unbending, refused. If Athena herself would compete with me, I would not back down, she said, and so the goddess revealed her true form, radiance filling the room, and the contest began. On one loom, Athena wove the glory of Olympus, the gods in majesty, mortals bowing, order enforced. Her tapestry was flawless, symmetrical, divine. On the other loom, Arachne's hands flew, and her threads reveal the gods' sins, the deceptions they preferred forgotten. Where Athena showed power, Arachne showed abuse. Where Athena showed reverence, Arachne showed violation, and her work, horrifyingly, was perfect. When the last shuttle fell silent, there was no denying it. Arachne's tapestry surpassed even Athena's. The goddess, flawless in craft, had been bested not in skill, but in courage, because Athena's cloth told comfort, Arachne's told truth, and truth, once seen, cannot be unseen. The rage that followed was less divine and more human. Athena struck Arachne's tapestry, tearing it to shreds, shredding the images that exposed her kin. Then she turned on the girl herself. Arachne, devastated, hung a rope around her neck, her pride collapsing into despair. But Athena was not finished. She touched the rope, transformed it, and Arachne's body shrank. Her fingers stretched, her form contorted until she became the first spider, her punishment to weave forever, suspended in silence, her art reduced to instinct, her voice silenced but her skill eternal. That's the story. But the story beneath the story is darker. Arachne's crime wasn't arrogance, it wasn't blasphemy, it was accuracy. She held up a mirror to power, and power broke her for it. She didn't fall because she lied, she fell because she told the truth too clearly. Just like Cassandra, her curse was not falsehood but being disbelieved, discredited, destroyed for honesty. Her tapestry was her prophecy, and like prophecy, it was unbearable to those who would rather not see. The Greeks feared her because they feared themselves. They knew their gods were not perfect. They knew the stories of seduction and violence, but those stories were tolerable as myth, as whispers, as entertainment, woven into clear form, displayed with undeniable precision. They became indictments, and indictments are dangerous. Arachne showed that truth, when made too visible, becomes monstrous to those invested in the lie. Her transformation into a spider carried its own symbolism. The Greeks despised spiders for their quiet patience, their silent webs, their relentless industry. Spiders never stopped weaving, never stopped watching. To be turned into one was humiliation but also permanence. Arachne could no longer tell stories people could read, but she wove anyway. Her legacy spread on threads invisible until you walked into them, until you felt them on your skin. Truth became web, unseen but unavoidable. Psychologically, Arachne represents the terror of being punished for excellence. How many of us have felt the sting of that you do something too well, too boldly, too honestly, and instead of praise, you receive hostility. Teachers who cut down their brightest students, bosses who sabotage subordinates who shine, societies that exile artists who speak too plainly. Arachne's monsterhood is not just in her 8 legs, it's in the reminder that greatness is often punished, especially when it challenges the powerful. And the web itself is a haunting metaphor. Webs catch, entangle, suffocate, but they also connect, stretch, endure. Arachne was silenced, but her truth stretched across generations, lingering in the fear of spiders, in the fascination with their webs. Every silk thread glinting in sunlight is a reminder of the girl who wove too well. Her curse was survival, not erasure. Modern echoes are everywhere. Consider the whistleblower punished for exposing corruption, the journalist silenced for reporting inconvenient truths, the artist censored for work too sharp, too honest. Each one is Arachne reborn, weaving tapestries the powerful tear apart, and each time, the punishment is the same, not engagement, but discrediting, humiliation, exile. The thread is cut, or so it seems, until the web reforms elsewhere. There's tragedy here, but also defiance, because Arachne, unlike Cassandra, didn't just speak the truth, she made it visible. She forced others to look, even if they ripped it down, and in her transformation, she didn't stop weaving. Her work continued in every web strung between branches, every spiral spun in corners. The gods tried to silence her, but they couldn't erase her hands. They cursed her to keep creating, even if no one wanted to see it. That's its own kind of victory. And maybe that's why spiders unsettle us. It isn't just the legs, the movement, the hidden webs. It's the reminder of what they mean that somewhere, something unseen is still weaving. that truths ignored still exist, patient, waiting. Step into a web, and you're caught not by the spider, but by the reality you refused to notice until it clung to your face. So let Arachne rest tonight, her loom quiet, her threads glistening in the dark. No accusations, no torn tapestries, no wrathful god. Only the steady rhythm of weaving transformed into something gentle, protective. The web becomes cradle instead of trap, and the girl who told the truth finally finds peace. Underneath the silence of webs, another truth lingered. The Greeks never told these stories in isolation. Cassandra's curse, Arachne's punishment, these were not outliers, not accidents, but parts of a larger pattern. Time and again, mortals who revealed too much, saw too clearly, or dared to excel beyond their station were broken into monsters. It was a theme the Greeks returned to like a haunting refrain, each variation a reminder that truth was a dangerous gift and talent, a double-edged blade. Consider Tiresias, the blind prophet of Thebes. Unlike Cassandra, he was believed, but the price of his sight was blindness. His story twisted through contradictions in one version. He struck 2 mating snakes and was transformed into a woman, living years in another body before being changed back. Because of that, Zeus and Hera summoned him to settle their argument about who enjoyed sex more, men or women. Tiresias told the truth, siding with Zeus, and Hera, humiliated, struck him blind. Zeus, unable to undo her curse, granted him prophecy as compensation. Truth gave him vision, but truth also cost him his eyes. In another tale, he revealed to Odysseus the way home, guiding him through the dangers of Scylla and Charybdis. But his prophecies were never joyful. His words were chains. He told Oedipus the truth about his parentage, about the crimes he had unknowingly committed, and the king's rage fell on him like fire. Even when Tiresias was right and he always was his truth destroyed, he carried the same weight as Cassandra, but instead of being dismissed, he was punished for being correct. That's the paradox. Silence and speech both lead to suffering when the truth is unbearable. Then there was Marsyas, the satyr who found Athena's discarded flute. When he played it, the notes were so haunting, so beautiful, that people whispered he rivaled Apollo himself. In arrogance or innocence, depending on who tells it, Marsyas challenged the god to a contest. Apollo, radiant and merciless, accepted. They played, and the satyr's music was raw, earthly, intoxicating, while Apollo's was divine, perfect, cold. The contest might have ended fairly, but Apollo changed the rules, demanding they play upside down, singing and strumming at once. Marsyas, mortal, failed. For his defiance, for daring to match truth in song against a god's vanity. He was flayed alive. His skin was nailed to a tree, his body screaming in silence. His truth was his talent, and his talent became his ruin. Do you see the pattern? Cassandra spoke truth and was cursed never to be heard. Arachne wove truth and was condemned to crawl in the dark. Tiresias saw truth and lost his sight. Marsyas sang truth and lost his skin. In myth after myth, the Greeks reminded themselves truth is not safe. Talent is not safe. To reveal too much is to attract the god's wrath, because power despises exposure. But why did these stories endure? Why retell them in temples, in plays, in whispered lullabies? Perhaps because they answered the question no one could ignore. Why do the gifted suffer? Why do the innocent fall? Why do the brightest flames seem to burn the quickest, leaving behind nothing but shadows? These myths weren't random. They were explanations, justifications, cautions. They told mortals stay small, stay silent, stay humble. Do not reach too high. Do not speak too clearly. Do not sing too loudly. The gods punish those who shine too brightly. And yet, there's another reading. One the Greeks may not have intended, but one we can't ignore. These cursed figures did not vanish. Cassandra still spoke. Her voice carried through centuries. Arachne still weaves in every corner of every house. Tiresias still appears in plays, a prophet blind but unflinching. Marsyas still haunts the forests, his blood turned into rivers, his music echoing in the wind. The gods silenced them, but the silencing failed. Their stories outlasted Olympus itself. What does that tell us, that truth? No matter how punished, endures. That talent, no matter how condemned, echoes. It's why we still speak of the Cassandra complex when warning goes unheeded, why spiders still spark awe and dread as artists of invisible threads, why blind prophets still appear in literature as symbols of hard-won wisdom, why musicians who challenge authority are still hailed as martyrs of art. The myths didn't kill these truths. They preserved them, wrapping them in horror so people would remember. There's something deeply psychological here. These figures embody the fear of standing out, of being extraordinary in a world that values conformity. They represent the isolation of seeing what others refuse to see, the loneliness of carrying burdens no one else acknowledges. And yet, they also embody defiance. Cassandra kept speaking, Arachne kept weaving, Tiresias kept prophesying, Marsyas kept playing until his last breath. Their suffering didn't erase them, it immortalized them. The Greeks, for all their cruelty, understood that monsters were not always born. Sometimes they were made by gods, by curses, by the unbearable weight of truth. And when mortals saw those stories, perhaps they nodded, half in fear, half in recognition. Because deep down, everyone knows what it feels like to be unheard, unappreciated, or punished for honesty. The myths took that quiet, private pain and gave it wings, webs, blind eyes, and flayed skin. They turned psychology into mythology, and mythology back into psychology. And maybe that's why, lying here tonight, their stories still hum in the dark. Cassandra's voice whispers in your ear, "Don't ignore what you already know." Arachne's web stretches across your mind. Beauty and truth are not always rewarded. Tiresias's blind gaze pierces you. Wisdom costs more than you think. Marsyas's flute still wails, art is dangerous, and that is its power. Together, they remind us that monsters aren't always claws and teeth. Sometimes they are simply the people who refuse to stop telling the truth. So rest now. The prophets are silent, the loom is still, the music has faded. The truths they carried can wait until morning. Tonight, there are no punishments, no curses, no divine wrath, only the soft dark, the steady beat of your breath, and the safety of knowing you are not alone. Heracles stood taller than most men, broad as the gates of a city, his arms swollen with the kind of strength poets could only exaggerate. He strangled serpents in his crib, broke lions with his bare hands, carried mountains on his shoulders. For generations, he was sung as the greatest of heroes, the demigod who bent the impossible to his will. But there's another side to his story, a darker thread woven into the songs of triumph Heracles as monster, not because of his strength, but because of what that strength did to him and to everyone around him. It began, as so many Greek stories did, with Hera's wrath. Zeus fathered Heracles with Alcmene, a mortal woman, and Hera, the queen of the gods, could not let it pass. From his first breath, she hated him. When he was just an infant, she sent 2 serpents slithering into his cradle, their tongues flickering, fangs dripping venom. Most children would have died before crying out, but Heracles reached with tiny fists, grabbed each snake by the throat and crushed them until they went limp. The palace celebrated. Hera seethed. A child who could strangle monsters before learning to walk, what horrors might he grow into? That question hung over him his whole life. For a time, he was the hero people hoped for. He hunted beasts that terrorized villages, cleansed stables that reeked of filth, chased birds that rained down death. His labors became the stuff of legend, but the same hands that slew monsters could not distinguish between enemy and family when madness fell upon him. Hera sent a fit of frenzy that tore through his mind like fire through dry grass. When it passed, his wife and children lay butchered at his feet, their blood soaking into the ground. Imagine the silence after that. A man who had held up the world, standing over the ruin of his own household. That was the moment Heracles stopped being a hero and became something more complicated, more terrifying. The Greeks called him a monster slayer, but in that act he became a monster himself. He knew it. He carried it like a chain, heavy and inescapable. The labors that followed weren't just tests, they were penance, atonement for the blood he could never wash away. Each victory was stained, every beast he conquered a reminder of the ones he couldn't protect. Take the Hydra. Heracles marched into the swamps of Lerna to cut off her heads, each one sprouting 2 more in its place. He scorched the stumps with fire, burying the immortal head beneath stone. A triumph, people said. But he dipped his arrows in her venom, carrying that poison with him from then on. It seeped into his story like ink into water, staining everything. Years later, it was that same venom, smeared on a cloak by his wife Deianira herself, deceived, that burned his flesh, peeling him alive until he begged for death. The Hydra never really left him. His victories were seeds of his destruction. And what of his temper? He was quick to anger, quicker to violence, or as in one story, denied a bride, he slew her father and brothers. In another, drunk at a feast, he killed his host's son over an insult. His strength made him unstoppable, but it also made him terrifying. Who could tell a man like that no? Who could stand against someone who could tear a bull apart with his hands? The line between protector and predator blurred until people whispered not just of his triumphs, but of their fear of him. The Greeks were not blind to this contradiction. They loved Heracles, yes, but they also saw the shadow he cast. In plays, he was often depicted as tragic, broken by his own impulses, mocked by the gods who toyed with him. Euripides wrote him stumbling home from the underworld, greeted as saviour, only to descend into madness and murder his family once more. He wasn't just a hero punished by Hera, he was a man undone by himself. His strength was both salvation and curse, his fame both crown and chain. What's haunting is how familiar that feels. Heracles is every story of power turning destructive, of heroes who cannot control the fire inside them. He's the soldier who returns home, carrying violence he can't put down. He's the celebrity who burns out under the weight of their own myth. He's the father who becomes the very danger he once promised to protect against. To the Greeks, he was a lesson greatness and monstrosity are not opposites. They live in the same body, sometimes in the same moment. His death only sharpened the paradox. Writhing in agony from the poisoned cloak, he built his own funeral pyre. No one dared light it until Philoctetes, a friend, took pity. Flames consumed Heracles' mortal body, but the gods lifted what remained to Olympus, granting him immortality. He married Hebe, goddess of youth, and sat among the very deities who had cursed him. Imagine that after a life soaked in blood, after madness and murder, after countless deaths at his hands, he was rewarded with eternity. Was that justice, or was it proof that the Greeks knew their gods admired destruction as much as creation? Heracles became worshipped not just as a hero, but as a god. Shrines dotted the Mediterranean. Prayers rose in his name. Farmers prayed for his strength, warriors for his courage, but beneath the hymns lingered unease, because to worship Heracles was to worship a monster who had been forgiven, not because he was innocent, but because he was powerful. His apotheosis was not redemption, it was assimilation. The monster was not destroyed, he was crowned. And here lies the real terror the Greeks admitted through Heracles, that monsters are not always defeated. Sometimes they are celebrated. Sometimes they become the very gods who rule us. That's why his story feels less like a triumph and more like a warning. Heroes can become monsters. Monsters can become gods. And power, once enthroned, rarely apologizes. Think of him standing now, somewhere between heaven and earth, the smoke of his pyre still clinging to his skin. His muscles glisten, his eyes burn, but behind the glory is a shadow that never leaves. The monster he became lingers, whispering in every hymn sung in his honor. That's why he endures not just as saviour, but as a reminder that the line between saviour and destroyer is thinner than we want to believe. So let the fire burn low tonight. The labours are done, the madness quiet, the cloak ash on the wind. Heracles rests, not as hero or monster, but as both. And in that uneasy peace, so can you. Achilles' name carried weight like thunder across the fields of Troy. Mothers hushed their children with it. Warriors stiffened when they heard it. Poets sang it as if the syllables themselves were edged in bronze. He was the greatest fighter Greece had ever known, swift-footed, nearly invulnerable, the son of a mortal king and the sea goddess Thetis. But the Greeks, for all their songs, did not paint him purely as a hero. They knew his story ended in rage, grief, desecration, a descent so violent it blurred the line between man and monster. It began with pride, the spark that would grow into wildfire. In the first year of the Trojan War, Agamemnon, commander of the Greek host, insulted Achilles by seizing a war prize, Briseis, the woman Achilles cherished. To Agamemnon, it was politics. To Achilles, it was humiliation. He withdrew from battle, sulking in his tent, his rage boiling but contained. And in his absence, the Greeks faltered. Men died. Fires burned. The war dragged. One man's pride became thousands of men's graves. Even before he struck, Achilles' wrath had teeth. But it wasn't until Hector killed Patroclus that Achilles' rage truly split him open. Patroclus wasn't just his companion, he was his other half, his brother in arms, his shadow. When Hector struck him down wearing Achilles' armor, it was as if Achilles himself had fallen. The grief broke him. His voice screamed across the shore, his cry so piercing that Trojan warriors stumbled, horses reared, the very air quaked. It was more than grief, it was transformation. From that moment, Achilles was no longer simply a warrior. He was vengeance made flesh. He donned new armor forged by Hephaestus, shield gleaming with the whole cosmos etched upon it, and returned to battle with a hunger not for victory but for slaughter. He cut down men like stalks of wheat, his spear flashing, his chariot wheels splashing blood as though they rode on rivers of it. The Scamander River itself rose against him, swollen with corpses, roaring in protest. Imagine that, a god of the river begging him to stop filling its waters with the dead, but Achilles, blinded by fury, refused. He fought even the river until it nearly drowned him. A man at war with nature itself, that's not heroism. That's monstrosity. When at last he faced Hector, it wasn't a duel of equals. It was inevitability. Hector ran, Achilles chased, 3 times around the walls of Troy until the gods themselves grew tired of the chase. When Achilles killed him, it was swift, merciless. But death wasn't enough. He pierced Hector's heels, tied him to his chariot, and dragged his body through the dust, around and around the city that had loved him. The Trojans wailed from the walls. Priam tore his robes. Hector's wife fainted at the sight. Still Achilles dragged the body day after day, a grotesque parade. This wasn't warrior's honor. It was desecration. It was cruelty so sharp it made even the gods recoil. And yet, the Greeks told this story not to condemn Achilles, but to reveal him. To show that the greatest warrior could become the most terrifying monster, not by losing, but by winning too absolutely. His rage made him invincible, and in that invincibility, he lost his humanity. When Priam, Hector's father, finally came in secret to beg for the body, he knelt at Achilles' feet, kissed the hands that had killed his son, and something broke again, not rage this time, but recognition. Achilles wept. For the first time since Patroclus fell, he remembered he was human. He returned Hector's body, and in that act, he saved himself from becoming only a monster. But the end was written long before. Thetis had warned him 2 fates lay before him. Stay home, live long, die forgotten, or fight at Troy, gain eternal glory and die young. He chose the second, and the Greeks, who revered Kleos' fame, the song that outlives the body, celebrated him for it. But beneath the glory was the shadow of the choice itself to embrace death. For memory is to embrace monstrosity. What kind of man picks glory over life? What kind of man chooses his name on the lips of strangers over the voices of his children? Achilles did. That's why he's remembered. That's why he terrifies. There's a psychological weight here that lingers even now. Achilles represents every drive that consumes us: anger, grief, ambition. He shows how easily love can twist into rage, how quickly pride becomes poison. And perhaps that's why we still tell his story. Not to celebrate his victories, but to warn ourselves what happens when passion has no leash. The Greeks knew war was monstrous, but they also knew that sometimes the monster was the very hero they needed to win it. When Paris's arrow, guided by Apollo, struck his heel, Achilles finally fell. The near immortal brought down not by armies or duels, but by the smallest wound in the smallest place. The man who made rivers rise with blood undone by something as fragile as flesh. That was the Greeks' final irony. No matter how monstrous you become, no matter how much rage or grief consumes you, mortality waits, and death reduces everyone heroes. monsters, kings to silence. But Achilles' silence was not the end. Poets sang of him for centuries. His wrath became the opening word of the Iliad, his name the standard of what it meant to be remembered. And yet, in every retelling, the shadow lingers. Achilles was a hero, yes, but he was also a warning. The man who turned his grief into slaughter, his pride into ruin, his love into desecration. A hero who became a monster, and in becoming one, became eternal. So let the battlefield grow quiet now. The flames die down, the river flows clear again, the dust settles over Hector's grave. Achilles lays down his spear, his rage exhausted, his grief softened. For tonight, he is no longer monster or hero. He is simply still, and in that stillness, you too can rest. Odysseus was never the strongest man on the battlefield, nor the tallest, nor the most dazzling. He did not have Achilles' wrath or Heracles' raw muscle. What he had was a mind sharper than bronze, a tongue that could twist lies into victories, a cunning that bent the world, and in a culture that valued wit almost as much as might, that made him a hero. But the Greeks also knew that cunning cuts both ways. Lies, once honed into weapons, can wound their wielder too, and Odysseus, for all his brilliance, left behind a trail of ruin that made him as monstrous as any foe he outwitted. The most famous of his tricks was the horse. After 10 years of war, the Greeks were broken, Troy unburned, the stalemate endless. It was Odysseus who conceived the gift, a massive wooden horse, hollowed, filled with soldiers. They left it at the gates, pretending to retreat. The Trojans dragged it inside, celebrating as if victory were theirs. And when night fell, Odysseus and his men spilled out, opening the gates, burning the city, slaughtering men in their sleep. It worked. It ended the war. But at what cost? The horse wasn't just strategy. It was treachery sanctified, deceit immortalized, a gift turned into a tomb, hospitality turned into massacre. To this day, Trojan horse means betrayal hidden inside kindness. The Greeks celebrated it as genius, but they also whispered unease, because if heroes win with lies, what separates them from villains? If war is ended by trickery, what honor is left in that sense? Odysseus didn't just end Troy. He ended the illusion that war was noble, and the gods noticed, Poseidon especially. When Odysseus blinded his son, the Cyclops Polyphemus, it wasn't just an act of survival, it was an act of arrogance. After he and his men escaped, Odysseus might have sailed quietly away, but he shouted back across the waves, taunting the monster, boasting of his name, declaring his triumph. That arrogance gave the Cyclops a target. He called on his father, and Poseidon cursed Odysseus to wander 10 more years. His journey home twisted into nightmare. It wasn't the blinding alone that doomed him. It was the pride, the need to be known, to claim the victory for himself. His cunning was brilliant, but his hubris was monstrous. Those 10 years became a gallery of horrors, many of his own making. He lingered with Circe, lying in her bed while his men begged to go home. He stayed years with Calypso, comforted by immortality while Ithaca wept. In each place, he left behind broken promises, grieving men, fractured trust. The Greeks told these stories with admiration, but also with warning. Odysseus was clever. Yes, but cleverness without restraint corrodes. It bends truth until truth snaps. And then there were the suitors. After 20 years away, Odysseus returned home at last. He found his halls filled with men feasting on his wealth, courting his wife, mocking his name, disguised as a beggar. He watched, plotted, waited, and when the time came, he revealed himself, stringing his bow, loosing arrows that pierced throats and hearts. One by one, the suitors fell, their blood soaking the very floors where they had laughed. It wasn't just justice, it was massacre. No mercy, no negotiation, no trial. And when the maids who had consorted with the suitors were rounded up, Odysseus ordered them hanged, their bodies twisting in the wind. Heroism blurred into vengeance, vengeance into cruelty. Some will say he was justified. The suitors desecrated his home, dishonored his wife, devoured his stores, but others whispered, was Odysseus reclaiming his kingdom, or was he reveling in slaughter? The Greeks feared the answer, because Odysseus had become not just a king returned, but a butcher cloaked in righteousness, and even beyond the suitors, his story grows darker. Later myths tell of Odysseus after Ithaca, restless, unsatisfied, seeking new lands until death found him far from home. Others tell of Telegonus, his own son by Circe, who came unknowingly to Ithaca and struck Odysseus down with a spear tipped in stingray spine. Fitting, isn't it the man who lived by cunning, undone not by war or fate, but by the child of one of his own entanglements? Even in death, Odysseus's lies caught up with him. So why did the Greeks tell his story at all if it showed so much ruin? Because Odysseus embodied a truth they couldn't ignore. Intelligence is power, and power corrupts. The Greeks admired his cleverness, but they also feared it. They saw in him the shadow of politicians, generals, tricksters, men who bend reality to their will, but leave wreckage behind. Odysseus was both saviour and monster, proof that cunning, when unbound, consumes everything. There's a modern resonance too. We still prize cleverness, celebrate outwitting opponents, admire those who bend the rules, but we also know the cost. Lies spread faster than truth. Trickery corrodes trust. Leaders who build their kingdoms on deceit may win in the short term, but the long-term rot is inevitable. Odysseus was the prototype of that paradox, the hero you cheer for, even as you recoil from his choices. And maybe that's the most haunting part. The Greeks didn't hide his flaws. They didn't try to sand him smooth into a perfect hero. They told the whole messy, monstrous truth that even the greatest minds can become prisons, that cunning without compassion is cruelty, that winning at any cost is a kind of defeat. So let the halls of Ithaca grow silent now. The suitors lie still, the bow unstrung, the torches dim. Odysseus sits at last beside Penelope, not as king or liar, not as hero or monster, but simply as a man worn thin by his own cleverness. And in that fragile quiet, the lesson lingers: brilliance can save you, but it can also unmake you. Tonight, it unravels into silence, leaving only rest underneath every claw, every serpent, every scream that echoed through the myths. There was always a reflection. The Greeks told of monsters, yes, but what they feared most was never the fangs or the fire. It was themselves. Each creature was a mirror, each horror a truth dressed in scales and shadows. And when we reach the end of this long parade of terrors, we find not beasts waiting for us, but questions. What do these monsters say about the people who dreamed them, and what do they still say about us? Typhon, that storm of flesh, was chaos personified. The reminder that even gods trembled before nature's fury. The Hydra was escalation, problems that multiplied the harder you fought. The Chimera was disorder, the unease of things that don't fit. Medusa was trauma turned into armor, pain made into power. Scylla and Charybdis were no-win choices, the inevitability of loss. The Minotaur was shame locked away until it grew teeth. The Harpies were humiliation with wings. Cassandra, the curse of truth unheard. Arachne, the punishment for honesty too clearly woven. Heracles, Achilles, Odysseus, heroes undone by themselves. Do you see the pattern? These weren't random monsters. They were maps of fear, portraits of the human condition, shadows of the very people who whispered them into being. The Greeks lived in a world both dazzling and brutal. Earthquakes toppled temples, storms sank fleets. War swallowed sons and left mothers weeping. They had no medicine for plague, no science for thunder, no therapy for grief. But they had stories. And in those stories they gave shape to the chaos. Fear became Typhon, regret became the Hydra, desire became Lamia, pride became Achilles. By turning feelings into monsters, they made the invisible visible. And when you can see something even in the dark, you can face it. That's why the myths endure. Because even now, long after the temples have crumbled, the monsters are still here. You don't need to believe in gods to feel their presence. You faced Typhon when your world suddenly collapsed and nothing felt stable. You faced the Hydra when problems multiplied no matter how hard you swung at them. You faced Medusa when trauma froze you in place, when looking backward turned you to stone. You faced the Furies in the dead of night, guilt whispering that you can't escape what you've done. You faced Achilles' rage, Odysseus' lies, Heracles' violence because those monsters aren't just myths. They're human. And maybe that's the real gift of Greek mythology, not the gods, not the heroes, but the monsters. Because monsters force honesty. Heroes can be polished, gods can be exalted, but monsters reveal the cracks. They ask questions no hymn dares ask. What do you do when grief curdles into hunger, when desire betrays you, when your brilliance isolates you, when your strength destroys what you love? The answers aren't easy. They weren't meant to be. They were meant to linger, to unsettle, to keep people awake at night just as they still keep us awake now. But there's also comfort hidden in the darkness. For all their horror, monsters are not invincible. Typhon was chained, Hydra burned, Chimera slain, Medusa beheaded, Minotaur struck down, even Achilles, monstrous in rage, fell to a single arrow. The Greeks admitted that no terror lasts forever. Fear can be named, pain can be faced. Even the worst nightmares dissolve when morning comes. And maybe that's why they told these tales around fires and in theatres, not to surrender to fear, but to contain it, to pass it through generations in shapes we could recognize. Now, standing at the end of the journey, the parade of monsters fades, the web is quiet, the river runs clear, the labyrinth's halls echo with nothing but wind, the harpy's wings are folded, the fury's torches dim, the heroes, for all their flaws, rest, and in that silence, the mirrors remain. You can look at them and see yourself, your rage, your grief, your cunning, your fear, but instead of recoiling, you can understand. And in understanding, maybe you tame them. So tonight, as you close your eyes, let the monsters drift back into shadow. They've told their truths. They've done their work. They leave you not with terror, but with recognition that to be human is to wrestle with chaos, with shame, with hunger, with pride. And that wrestling is not weakness. It's life. Let the silence settle now. Let the monsters rest. Let your breath slow, your body ease, your mind grow still. Because you've walked through every shadow the Greeks could conjure, and you've come out the other side. The stories are done. The night is yours. Sleep.